I'm a wildlife conservation biologist. I study wildlife and I try to keep them on the planet. When I was a kid, I watched National Geographic videos and I heard for the first time, which is the sound of the Indri. The Indri is the largest lemur in Madagascar, and I wanted to be a primatologist. By my junior year in college, I had convinced someone who was a primatologist to let me go with them to Madagascar and study lemurs. The Indri that you see there is one of more than 100 species of primates found on Madagascar that are endemic. That means they're found only there and nowhere else on Earth. About 93% of the reptiles and amphibians, more than half the birds. About 85% of everything you find on Madagascar is unique. And the reason for that is that Madagascar has been isolated where it is for more than 100 million years. So what species that have been there have engaged in this adaptive radiation in isolation from the rest of the world? And while it may be called the fourth continent, it's the fourth largest island, it's also called the eighth continent because of that high degree of endemism and diversity. On the east coast, you see the rainforest. On the west coast, there's dry forest. In the south, there's spiny forest. The habitats there are just as varied. But there's a problem. The image that you see there shows deforestation in the east coast rainforests of Madagascar up until 1985, nearly 30 years ago. I first went to Madagascar nearly 10 years after that, in 1994, on that lemur project I was telling you about. And they gave the new kid the easiest lemur to follow. This one had an old, big radio collar that didn't work anymore, and it was the easiest one to see because it had this whip antenna that moved back and forth. And so I was able to track it and see it. And these things are about the size of cats, and they're running through treetops, so they're not the easiest things in the world to spot. And the lemur that I was responsible for collecting data on disappeared. A few weeks later, we were using radio telemetry to go find the primate group that it had disappeared from, and we started hearing this phantom ticking sound in between the beeps of the radio collar that was working in the group. And we turned into the frequency of this, and it turns out it was the frequency of this collar that hadn't worked for years. And so we tracked into it because we hadn't seen that animal for a while, and we were looking at where it must be, and then we looked down, and we saw its remains. Our guide right then, who was a guy who was never lost, his name was Pierre, he was brave, was a former hunter, said, "A Fusa got it." And he suddenly blanched, and he wanted to leave. I'd never heard of a Fusa before, but seeing this guy's reaction made me think, I want to leave too. I expected a tiger to come bounding out. I knew Madagascar didn't have any big cats, but I thought we were all about to get eaten, and so did he. It turns out that carnivores actually ate their way into my career. What happened is, as this lemur was being eaten, the Fusa chewed on that radio collar and reconnected the battery wires that sent that signal that made us find the remains and allowed me to hear the word Fusa for the first time. In the intervening 18 years, we've learned a lot about Fusa. We've learned that there are about 3,000 of them left in Madagascar, a country about the size of our west coast. We've learned that they're among the first things to disappear in the presence of habitat encroachment. We've learned that they can eat just about anything with a heartbeat. There may not be big cats on Madagascar, but this mongoose that looks like a short, lean cougar can take care of that niche. But we've also learned that they have a problem too, just like wildlife around the rest of the world. And that's people. There are 7 billion of us. We all agree that that could be a problem. But I'd like to say that we're also the solution, especially at the local level. When I first started working in Madagascar in 1994, there were 12 billion people in Madagascar. Now, there are 12 million people in Madagascar. Now there are 22 million. And it turns out that the first radio-collared Fusa I ever had walked into a village and was killed. I found this out because, once again, I tracked the signal, and I found this collar that had been cut off the body. I knew early on that I was going to have to do a lot for the conservation of this animal if I was going to do anything with its biology. Now, those 22 million people in Madagascar, by and large, about 3/4 of them are subsistence farmers. They grow rice in order to eat, to survive. The best place to grow rice, unfortunately, is where usually the best forests are growing. And after a few seasons, heavy rains come down and they pelt the soil, and they wash that topsoil out to sea. And if you look at an image of Madagascar, in the rainy season, it looks like the island is hemorrhaging. It's what little nutrient-rich soil it has into the Mozambique Channel or out into the Indian Ocean, because literally it is. This is an image of Ankara Fonskin National Park where I work. There are rice fields right in the middle of the national park. Do we see a problem beginning to emerge? That's Fusa habitat. But there are people there as well. But they didn't have alternatives. So, what we see them advertising there to sell, wrapped up in those banana leaves, is the Malagasy equivalent of Viagra. There are these leaves that come from a plant there, and they sell them on the roadside, and truckers, as they're driving through the national park, would stop and pick up a little bit and get in their truck and quickly drive away. And that's the only thing they had to do in terms of commerce. And they had no alternatives to growing rice in order to survive. One day in 1999, when I was the first year I had these groups of volunteers from an organization called the Earthwatch Institute going by. The women were shelling the rice that they had just harvested, and they were singing, and it was beautiful. And I said to them, you know, foreigners will pay a lot of money to hear you do that. And they said, no, really? And I said, yeah, really. And so we had 5 different periods where volunteers came through and worked with us in the field, and the women sang these songs, these traditional folklore songs, and they saved the money they made. When I went back the next year, they had, of their own volition, taken their soccer field, which was not a very good soccer field. It was kind of on a hill, so it was pretty easy to tell who was going to win just before the match ever started, and they converted it to this campsite. Now, the theme of this event is the power of everyone, and the power of people is truly amazing. These people came up with this idea on their own, and they asked, would we help? And we have. Since 2000, they've served more than 100,000 plates of food to ecotourists, scientists, and other visitors to this national park. They don't need to continue growing more rice and slashing more forests in Ankara Fonskin. That takes care of the adult generation. The youth, however, need a way out of that cycle as well, and that's through education. Another regular person, a guy named Pete Belaski, who was an Earthwatch volunteer, came out and he said, what can I do? What's the best thing if you could only do one thing? And I said, Pete, I'd build schools. Pete Belaski, a veterinarian from Davie, Florida, formed an NGO called Friends of Madagascar that in the last 5 years has built or renovated 28 schools serving about 5,000 kids across Madagascar. It's a really good start. It's a two-pronged approach. The adults need an alternative. The kids need a way out. That way out is delivered through education. What does that have to do with Fusa? That alleviates the pressure on the habitat. Now, that's what the school looked like in the spring, and it's opening this year in Ankara Fonskin, in the village adjacent to that campsite. So Pete first came, visited that campsite, and now there's a school there for the local kids in that village. Another problem comes from wood use, not only for clearing for growing rice, but cooking that rice. The vast majority of meals are cooked over an open fire. That's not very efficient. What you see there on the right, that middle image, is the amount of deforestation in Ankara Fonskin National Park over a 10-year period, from 1990 to 2000. About 22% of the forest cover in Ankara Fonskin was lost, in part because of the need to have wood to cook rice. Well, one of my Malagasy students came up with this idea of a rocket stove. Now, this is not a novel concept, but it was novel to apply it in this place, where local people can build out of local clays this essentially enclosed heating chamber that the pot goes on top of. It requires less than half the wood of an open fire. It has much less in the way of emissions, so it's healthier for people. And it really cuts down not only on cooking time, but the use of wood, and therefore helps to also preserve habitat for the Fusa, this carnivore. They also sell them in the local market. The fourth image down there on the left is what forest change in Madagascar, in Ankara Fonskin National Park has looked like in the last 10 years. And that light green you see is actually reforestation. That's a very, very relieving image to take a look at. Now, carnivores in Madagascar have the same problems that carnivores around the world do. And while I started out as a kid watching National Geographic videos, back in 2007, National Geographic gave me a call and said, "Congratulations, we're going to make you an emerging explorer." So I hung up the phone, obviously thinking it was a prank call. When they called back and gave me the number of the switchboard, I called back and very sheepishly thanked them for that. And National Geographic, as you know, has these explorers in residence. Derek and Beverly Joubert are longtime explorers in residence for National Geographic. And they've been taking pictures and videos of big cats their entire careers. And they had pushed National Geographic to go a step farther. The mission of Geographic is to inspire people to care about the planet. Derek and Beverly wanted them to do something. So the Big Cats Initiative was born. It's not just about reporting anymore, it's about conserving. Using those lessons from the field in Madagascar, I was able to work with them to put an implementation in place for this initiative to halt the decline of big cat populations worldwide. It's built on assessment, protection, and communication. Geographic is already very good at communication. But assessment, that takes a chapter from the scientist's book. We can't adequately protect what we don't know. To put things in context is often very important for wildlife conservation. This map that you see here shows human population density in Africa. That same continent is home to the remaining 30,000 lions in the wild, home to 10,000 cheetah, and home to 1 billion people. The lessons from Madagascar were just a petri dish. It was the elementary school for the big problems that are facing big cats all around the planet. The protection component of the Big Cats Initiative is based in a grants program. And what the Big Cats Initiative grants program has been able to do in the last 2 years is fund 33 projects in 16 countries to the tune of about $800,000. And that doesn't sound like a lot of money if you put it in the context of being just a few dozen miles away from Washington, D.C. But when you realize that the focus of those funds is the grassroots level in the places where big cats exist and where big cats and human populations so often collide, that amount of money is very effective. What grantees have done, much like the work in Madagascar, is engage with local communities, seeking solutions. In many cases, lions are killed not because they're a big, scary predator, but because they stole someone's livestock. Fortifying a boma, a corral, for example, can alleviate this potential conflict that would lead to the loss of big cats in an area. It's a simple solution, and we've put a lot of money behind it. There are now hundreds of bomas in areas where they weren't particularly well fortified before that are there now, and they're making a huge difference in keeping people happier in having to coexist with big cats. I'd like to share some of those results in the grantee's own words.
It's hearing, it's smelling that environment, it's listening for lion roars out in the distance. These are the most iconic animals in Africa, possibly in the world today. And to come face to face with something that changes your life profoundly.
We do need to act now. It requires understanding the habitats, understanding of the local human populations and communities and how those things influence nature.
What makes National Geographic, and particularly its Big Cats Initiative, unique is that we're funding people who are in the front line of conservation.
This was an amazing new opportunity to bring African conservationists onto a global platform and tell their stories.
By focusing our efforts where people and big cats collide, we can try to find ways to coexist, and that's how we win this battle.
One of the successful stories that I'm working on right now actually relates to the pesticide poisoning of wildlife in Africa. We were able to actually bring this to global attention, and we've been able to have this chemical withdrawn from Eastern Africa.
Conservation has to be very locally driven. In every village we've employed what we call a conflict officer. They are the point person in that village for monitoring all the losses and helping people implement the most relevant solutions for reducing those losses in the future.
Enclose the livestock in a predator-proof boma, which is like a corral or an enclosure. It's really cheap, it's really effective, and it's dropped the mortality rate of lions in the areas where this is being implemented by 2/3 in just the first year that it's been done.
We actually have to do hands-on conservation. So it is important that we take action right now to try and protect areas that could go tomorrow.
Go to causeunuproar.org, learn more, and share that information with all your friends.
Cause an uproar!
Now, Paula Kahumbu, who you just saw there roaring, Derek and Beverly Joubert, who you just saw introducing the idea of the Big Cats Initiative and who co-founded the initiative, and BCI grantee Layli Lichtenfeld have all given TED Talks as well, and I encourage you to go online and watch those TED Talks also. They're quite inspiring. The theme of today is the power of everyone. The power of people is amazing. There's 7 billion of us. That's a problem. But those 7 billion people are also the key to solutions for conserving carnivores and wildlife worldwide. Thank you.